my microeconomics professor did a class on futures and options. The first time he did it, he visited a grain elevator, a flour mill, meat packing plant, came up to the exchanges, and that was in January 1976. So I fell in love with the place then. I know it was quite random, but I had the best results in the class on the paper trading we did in that class. And I was all fired up to find a job down here, but I grew up in Indiana and didn't know anybody down here. So I found a summer job in the summer of 1977 as a runner for Untitled Commodities. I was a student abroad in Europe the second semester of my junior year in 1978. And I'd been dating a young lady for about 6 weeks, maybe 2 months at that time, and trying to get my summer job back. France at that time had direct dial international phones, and that was unusual at that time. So I actually traveled from Germany to France with the girlfriend to direct dial the U.S., a broker who'd somewhat befriended me on the floor the year before, to call him about getting my summer job back as a runner. And I come out of this phone booth fist pumping. Yes, I've got a job in the hog pit. And my girlfriend, who was a city girl, is looking at me like, I think I need to change boyfriends at this point. Now she's my wife of 38 years, but she was just looking at me like I had two heads. Oh my gosh, this guy's so excited about being in a hog pit. And when I turned 21, I started to work to get a lease and a membership, and was able to do that. My father lent me $5,000 and signed a letter of credit and mortgage papers for his home in order to give me the backing to get started trading. I actually got my membership the first few days of October 1979, and that was the week before the weekend when Paul Volcker decided to target money supply instead of Fed funds. So timing is everything, and I was a T-bill trader. I'd gone from the livestock where I'd been a clerk and a runner to T-bills because I could do that on the IMM membership, which was, a little more affordable, and that's where I started. The hours, the limited hours we had, where they rang a bell at the start and rang a bell at the end, and you couldn't really trade outside those hours if you were trading futures, we were very fortunate to be able to live that life where we had family time to dedicate. I mean, that's been the change in the electronic world, and one of the reasons I've recently retired is because, for the last dozen years at least, I've been spending, all my waking hours and some of my middle of the night hours in front of a trading screen as I managed both the technology and the risk. And, I've been telling myself as I've gotten a little older here, sitting in front of a screen 18 hours a day is not the healthiest thing to do. And, someday life may throw me a curve and I have to sit in a chair. So I'm going to go move my body and enjoy life while I can. And then I can come sit in a chair again 10 years from now, perhaps, and entertain myself productively. Voice, hearing, somebody screaming in your ear for 6 hours or 8 hours a day, that didn't do any. All my friends are a little bit hard of hearing, including myself. I think that's pretty normal. I was a spreader. I was in the pit, and I would, as much as possible, direct order flow to the brokers to work on my behalf. So I'd be just directing traffic down from the middle of the pit. It's probably one of the reasons it was easier for me to survive a transition from pit trading to electronic trading. There's anxiety building right up to that start as you're trying to figure out where the pricing is going to be. I mean, there was no book showing you indicative pricing, right? I mean, people were testing the water with throwing quotes out there, typically, and indications of openings, but it was, you could see the possible mispricings, and you were trying to figure out how you were going to execute on those as a spreader, especially, working to eliminate those inefficiencies. I installed the first phone bridge for a trading group at the CME floor. So my little group of traders in the Eurodollar pit, we were all on a single phone bridge. And I know that was the first installation like that at CME. So it was a lot like air traffic control. It was almost like internalization of order flow a little bit in a constructive way. So if I'm a spreader and I'm throwing a leg up front, let's say from the back, the guy up front who takes that, he just takes it as an input. He might sell it right where I've asked him to sell it, but he might do something else with it. It becomes part of his inventory, and how does he best manage that? I remember very specifically the competition for the certificate of deposit contract that opened in the summer, I think it was May of '81. It was the same day Charles and Diana was married. So just coincidence. DC was this contract symbol, and Diana and Charles, and it was that day. There were 3 exchanges competing for that contract then. New York Futures Exchange, NYFE, Chicago Board of Trade, and CME. And there was a 3-way competition going there. And CME won that contract, in my view, because we had the Treasury bills to spread against, and we could make tighter markets. In the 08-09 bust there, your crack spreads went negative for a significant period. And I didn't expect that, and probably was overly long those and had a little bit of a painful trade there. So that would have been probably my worst trade. My best day still goes back to the '87 Monday. It was wild. I mean, in the Eurodollars that morning, for the first 15 minutes anyway, your bid offers were 25 basis points wide and trading. And I don't know that at any time during that day they got tighter than 5 points and trading. So, you go into a day like that, okay, what are my risk parameters here? What am I going to lose if I'm really wrong? What am I going to lose if I have an out trade? How big do I want to trade? But boy, is there opportunity here. Let's go. Honestly, I became a spreader because, again, I didn't have any money I could afford to lose. I started trading when I was 21 with borrowed money. So I said to myself, this is no place for pride. You are the youngest guy, the least capitalized guy, and the least experienced guy. Just do what you can to stay out of trouble. And, that's what I followed for a long time. And, the first lesson I learned in the trading pits was never hesitate, because when you hesitate, the good ones are gone, the bad ones are still there. You're going to get 100% of the bad ones and only a fraction of the good ones. It's going to skew your odds dramatically. The floor community, I think people have used the term frenemies before. It's fairly a modern term, but it was fairly active. Everybody was a fierce competitor, and some people got along not as well as others. But overall, everybody had the same commitment to helping the business grow, serving the customers, and keeping a level playing field. The vast majority of people that were kind of nabbed for trading on the curb, if you will, and trading on the curb was certainly against the rules, but the vast majority of it was highly constructive in the marketplace, meaning brokers, it was in the Eurodollar pit at the time, and brokers would squeeze the customer order to the last second, and then they would hit you as a local, they would hit you as the bell rang, and maybe in their haste, they wouldn't hit the guy who really had made the market, or they'd give you a quantity that was more than you were looking for, and the guy next to you still wanted some. And in that curb trading that occurred pretty regularly, it was just that evening up that went around. After that sting, and the enforcement of that is the closing bell rang, and everybody went like that, and the brokers are looking around like, oh boy, what do I do now? And so what happened? The exchanges recreated the constructive piece of that and created the post-close sessions. At one point, my clerk, his father passed away, and he had to be gone, and it was a busy time. My wife came and filled in for him, and she couldn't figure out why she had bruises on her breastbone until in the latter part of the week she figured out they were from her buttons. It was that packed on that trading floor, that packed in the T-bill pit, that as a woman, she was so smashed in where her face was, going from in the pit to out of the pit with heads and people pressed at the top of the T-bill pit. She had bruises from her buttons. I always paid attention to the policies and participated on many committees, primarily floor communication, which dealt with displays and things like that, market data, those kinds of committees I participated in for whatever reason. I remember once Brian Moneson was actually chairman of the exchange when we moved to the Wacker Drive address. I remember going to Brian at one point with the question about some policy, and he kind of looked at me seriously. I'm a young kid. I'm a little bit afraid of him, and he looks at me and says, "Where have you been?" I said, "What do you mean, where have I been?" He says, "How come you're not involved in exchange, politics, governance?" I'm not sure which word he used. And I said, well, I assume that people in those roles know a whole lot more about it than I do. He looked at me and he says, I wouldn't make that assumption if I were you. When I was 50 years old and they asked me, I said, okay, I've got enough knowledge at this point and a short enough window in front of me that if I don't say yes now, I'll never say yes. And I did. And I'm very honored to have been elected. I'm very proud of the fact that in every time I ran in the 10 years, I was the #1 vote getter in my division. So I think members knew I was a guy who would take the job seriously and do the right thing for the right reasons. I was always out there experimenting in kind of almost too far ahead sometimes on thinking about things like that. So I was quite aware that it was going to go that way. I switched over at the end of '97 to be full-time on the screens. In fact, I hacked Globex a little bit to pull the data from it, which they didn't have an interface for that in those early days, and I was told not to do that as well, and I stopped. But I realized, there were going to be other people who had more capital and more resources than I ever would, and so I kind of had golden handcuffs as a trader, and I might as well just keep enjoying keeping life simple and trading with a small group of people.